David Hume stands as one of the most revolutionary and dangerous thinkers in all of human history. Born in Edinburgh, Scotland, in 1711, during the height of the Scottish Enlightenment, he would grow up to challenge nearly every fundamental belief that had guided human thought for over 2,000 years. His ideas were so radical and threatening to established authority that many of his works were banned. His academic career was destroyed, and religious leaders across Europe denounced him as a threat to civilization itself. Yet today, nearly 3 centuries later, his influence pervades every corner of modern thought. Hume lived in an age when most educated people still believed that human reason could unlock the deepest secrets of reality. Philosophers confidently constructed elaborate systems that claimed to prove the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, and the absolute foundation of moral truth. Scientists believed they were discovering eternal laws that governed the universe with mathematical precision. Religious authorities proclaimed that divine revelation provided certain knowledge about the nature of existence. Into this world of confident certainty came David Hume, armed with nothing more than careful observation and relentless logical analysis. Like a philosophical detective, he examined every claim about knowledge and reality with microscopic attention to detail. What he discovered shook the intellectual world to its foundation and continues to challenge how we think about truth, science, morality, and the very nature of human experience. He showed that most of what people confidently believed to be certain knowledge was actually based on psychological habits, social customs, and unexamined assumptions. Hume approached philosophy not as a grand system builder, but as a careful scientist of human nature. He wanted to understand how the human mind actually works, not how philosophers thought it should work. He studied the mechanics of belief formation, the psychology of moral judgment, and the logical structure of reasoning itself. What emerged from his investigations was a picture of human nature that was both humbling and liberating, showing that we are far more limited in our knowledge than we had imagined, but far more interesting in our psychology than anyone had suspected. Part 1. The Empirical Revolution. Hume built his entire philosophical revolution on one deceptively simple principle that would ultimately transform how humanity thinks about knowledge itself. He argued that every single piece of information in the human mind must ultimately trace back to sensory experience. This idea, known as empiricism, might seem obvious at first glance, but Hume pushed it to its logical extreme and discovered implications that no one had anticipated. If everything we know comes through our 5 senses, then the scope of possible human knowledge becomes both more limited and more interesting than anyone had previously imagined. Consider what happens during the most basic act of perception. When you look at what appears to be a red apple sitting on a wooden table, your eyes detect patterns of light waves bouncing off various surfaces. These light waves trigger chemical reactions in your retina, which send electrical signals through your optic nerve to your brain. Your brain processes these signals and creates the conscious experience of seeing a red apple on a wooden table. But here is Hume's crucial insight. You never actually encounter the apple itself, only your brain's interpretation of certain physical stimuli. The real apple, if it exists at all as something independent of your perception, remains forever hidden behind the veil of your sensory experience. This observation led Hume to distinguish between 2 fundamentally different types of mental contents. He called the immediate, vivid experiences of sensation impressions, and he called the copies or memories of these experiences ideas. When you see a bright red rose in full sunlight, that vivid sensory experience is an impression. When you later remember that rose or imagine a similar one, you are working with ideas derived from the original impression. Hume argued that every idea in the human mind, no matter how complex or abstract, must ultimately be constructed from simpler impressions received through the senses. This principle became known as the copy theory of ideas, and it served as the foundation for everything else Hume would discover about human knowledge. The implications of this theory were staggering and immediate. If all ideas come from impressions, then any concept that cannot be traced back to sensory experience must be meaningless or confused. Consider the idea of an infinitely perfect God. We have impressions of things that are good, powerful, and wise, but we have no impression of infinite perfection itself. Similarly, we have no direct sensory experience of substances, souls, or necessary connections between cause and effect. These concepts, Hume suggested, are either meaningless combinations of words or confused mixtures of simpler ideas that we have illegitimately combined. This approach revolutionized how philosophers thought about the relationship between language and reality. Instead of assuming that every meaningful word must refer to some real entity in the world, Hume demanded that every concept prove its legitimacy by showing its connection to actual human experience. Words like substance, essence, and absolute truth might sound profound and important, but if they cannot be grounded in sensory impressions, they tell us more about the confusion of language than about the nature of reality. This insight laid the groundwork for centuries of later philosophy that would emphasize the analysis of language and concepts rather than speculation about metaphysical entities. Hume also discovered something remarkable about how the human mind combines simple impressions into complex ideas. He identified three basic principles of association that govern how our thoughts naturally flow from one idea to another. The first principle is resemblance, which explains why thinking about one thing often reminds us of similar things. When you see a photograph of a friend, your mind naturally moves to ideas about the friend himself because of the resemblance between the image and your memories. The second principle is contiguity in space and time, which explains why we associate things that occur close together. Thinking about thunder naturally leads to thoughts about lightning because we have experienced them together so often. The third principle is cause and effect, which connects our ideas about events that seem to produce or influence other events. The smell of smoke immediately brings thoughts of fire because of our past experience with this causal relationship. These principles of association revealed something profound about human psychology. Much of what we call reasoning is actually the automatic operation of psychological mechanisms that connect our ideas according to natural patterns. We do not consciously choose to associate thunder with lightning or smoke with fire. These connections happen automatically based on the structure of our past experience. This insight suggested that human thinking follows psychological laws, just as physical events follow natural laws. Understanding these psychological laws became central to Hume's project of developing a science of human nature that would be as precise and systematic as physics or chemistry. The empirical principle also led Hume to a startling conclusion about the limits of human reason itself. If all knowledge comes from sensory experience, then we can never know anything about the ultimate nature of reality that lies beyond the reach of our senses. We cannot know whether our perceptions correspond to external objects, whether the physical world exists independently of our minds, or whether other people have conscious experiences similar to our own. All we can ever study directly are the contents of our own consciousness, the flow of impressions and ideas that constitute our mental life. This position, known as phenomenalism, suggested that philosophy should focus on describing the patterns within human experience rather than making claims about reality beyond experience. It was a humble but revolutionary approach that would influence centuries of later thinkers who struggled with the relationship between mind and world. Part 2. The Problem of Induction. Hume discovered what many philosophers consider the most devastating problem in all of human knowledge, a puzzle so profound that it continues to challenge scientists and thinkers nearly 3 centuries later. This problem strikes at the very heart of scientific reasoning and everyday common sense, threatening the foundation of everything we think we know about the world around us. The problem concerns one of the most basic activities of human thinking, making predictions about the future based on patterns we have observed in the past. Every day we perform this kind of reasoning countless times without even thinking about it, but Hume showed that this fundamental process cannot be rationally justified. Consider the simple act of expecting the sun to rise tomorrow morning. This expectation seems perfectly reasonable because the sun has risen every single day throughout recorded human history. Millions of people have witnessed millions of sunrises, creating an unbroken pattern that stretches back to the beginning of human consciousness. Based on this overwhelming evidence from the past, we confidently predict that the pattern will continue into the future. But Hume asked a deceptively simple question that no one had seriously considered before. What logical justification do we have for believing that the future will resemble the past? At first this question might seem almost silly. Of course the future will resemble the past. That is just how the world works. But Hume pressed deeper and showed that this obvious truth is actually impossible to prove using either logic or experience. We cannot use pure logic to demonstrate that tomorrow will be like today, because there is nothing logically contradictory about the idea that natural patterns might suddenly change. It is perfectly conceivable from a logical standpoint that the sun might not rise tomorrow, that gravity might stop working, or that fire might stop burning wood. These possibilities might seem wildly unlikely, but they are not logically impossible in the way that a square circle or a married bachelor would be impossible. Perhaps we can justify our faith in future patterns by appealing to past experience. After all, we have observed that nature has been remarkably consistent throughout human history. But Hume pointed out that this approach leads to circular reasoning that proves nothing at all. To use past experience to justify our belief that the future will resemble the past, we must already assume that past patterns of consistency will continue into the future. In other words, we must assume the very thing we are trying to prove. This is like trying to verify the accuracy of a ruler by measuring it with itself. The process tells us nothing new and simply moves in a logical circle. The problem becomes even more troubling when we consider the role of induction in scientific knowledge. Every scientific law and theory depends on the assumption that experiments conducted today will reveal truths that apply tomorrow. When a scientist drops objects of different weights and observes that they fall at the same rate, she infers a general law about gravitational acceleration. But this inference from observed cases to unobserved cases cannot be justified through logic alone. The scientist has no logical guarantee that gravity will behave tomorrow as it behaved today. Yet, without this assumption, scientific knowledge becomes impossible. Hume had discovered that all empirical science rests on a faith that cannot be rationally defended. This insight led Hume to distinguish between two fundamentally different kinds of reasoning. Relations of ideas involve concepts that are logically connected, such as mathematical truths and definitions. When we say that all bachelors are unmarried men, we are expressing a relation of ideas that is necessarily true by definition. These truths can be known with certainty through pure thought, but they tell us nothing about the actual world beyond our concepts. Matters of fact, on the other hand, involve claims about the actual world that go beyond logical definitions. When we say that the sun will rise tomorrow, or that fire burns wood, we are making claims about matters of fact that cannot be proven through pure logic. Hume showed that all reasoning about matters of fact depends ultimately on the relation of cause and effect. We predict that the sun will rise because we believe that the rotation of the earth causes the appearance of sunrise. We expect fire to burn wood because we believe that the chemical properties of fire cause combustion when applied to combustible materials. But our knowledge of causal relations comes entirely from experience, not from logic. We have never observed causation itself, only the constant conjunction of events that we interpret as causally connected. This led Hume to his most famous conclusion about the nature of inductive reasoning. The belief that the future will resemble the past is not a conclusion of reason, but a habit of mind that develops naturally through repeated experience. When we observe the same sequence of events over and over again, our minds automatically develop the expectation that the pattern will continue. This expectation is not based on logical reasoning, but on what Hume called custom or habit. Our psychology is structured in such a way that repeated experiences create mental habits that generate predictions about future experience. This is not a flaw in human reasoning, but rather the way our minds are naturally designed to navigate a world where patterns tend to persist over time. The problem is that this psychological mechanism cannot be rationally justified, even though it appears to be essential for survival and practical life. Hume realized that this conclusion had profound implications for human knowledge and scientific practice. It means that our most basic beliefs about the world rest not on rational foundations, but on natural psychological tendencies that we cannot help but follow. We cannot prove that the future will resemble the past, but we cannot help believing that it will. We cannot demonstrate that our scientific theories reveal eternal truths about nature, but we cannot function practically without assuming that they do. This creates what Hume saw as a permanent tension in human life between the skeptical conclusions of philosophical reasoning and the natural beliefs that guide practical action. We are rational enough to see the limits of our own rationality, but not rational enough to live according to those limits. Part 3. Causation and Necessary Connection. Of all the concepts that Hume subjected to his empirical analysis, none proved more important or more surprising than the idea of causation itself. The relationship between cause and effect seems like one of the most obvious and fundamental features of reality. When we strike a match, it lights. When we drop a stone, it falls. When we touch fire, it burns our skin. These causal connections appear so clear and necessary that most people never question their ultimate nature. But Hume looked more carefully at what actually happens during causal interactions, and discovered that our common-sense understanding of causation is largely an illusion created by the structure of human psychology. What we call causation, he argued, tells us more about how our minds work than about how the world works. When most people think about causation, They imagine some kind of mysterious force or power that connects causes to their effects. They picture the striking of the match as somehow forcing or producing the flame, as if there were an invisible chain of necessity linking the action to the result. This intuitive picture suggests that causes contain some special quality or energy that compels their effects to occur. But Hume challenged this entire way of thinking by asking a simple question about what we actually observe during causal interactions. When you watch a match being struck and see the flame appear, what exactly do you perceive with your senses? You see the match being dragged across the rough surface. You observe sparks and then flame. But do you ever actually see the striking producing or forcing the flame to exist? Hume argued that careful empirical analysis reveals only 3 observable features in what we call causal relationships. First, we observe spatial contiguity between cause and effect, meaning they occur close together in space. The striking occurs at the same location as the appearance of the flame. Second, we observe temporal priority, meaning the cause happens before the effect. The striking occurs slightly before the flame appears. Third, and most importantly, we observe constant conjunction, meaning that similar causes are regularly followed by similar effects in our experience. Whenever we have observed matches being struck in the proper conditions, flames have appeared. But beyond these 3 observable features, Hume insisted, there is nothing else that empirical investigation can discover about causation. Most significantly, we never observe what Hume called necessary connection, the supposed force or power that makes effects follow necessarily from their causes. No amount of careful attention to causal interactions can reveal any mysterious energy that flows from cause to effect. We see events following each other in regular patterns, but we never see the necessity that supposedly governs these patterns. The idea of necessary connection, Hume concluded, cannot be traced back to any sensory impression and therefore has no legitimate place in empirical knowledge. What we call the necessity of causal relationships is actually a psychological projection that comes from the structure of our own expectations rather than from observation of the world. When we say that striking a match must produce a flame, we are describing the strength of our psychological expectation rather than any objective feature of reality. This analysis led Hume to a revolutionary redefinition of what we mean by causation. Instead of being a mysterious force that governs events in the world, causation is simply the regular succession of events as experienced by human observers. A cause is an event that is spatially contiguous with, temporally prior to, and constantly conjoined with another event we call the effect. There is no deeper metaphysical reality behind these observable patterns, no hidden essence that makes causation what it is. Causation, in other words, is not a feature of the world independent of human experience, but rather a way of describing regularities within human experience. This insight marked a fundamental shift from thinking about causation as an objective force to thinking about it as a subjective organizing principle of human cognition. The psychological dimension of Hume's analysis proved equally important and revolutionary. He argued that our belief in necessary connection arises from the repeated experience of constant conjunction between similar events. When we observe the same sequence over and over again, our minds develop a habit of expecting the second event whenever we encounter the first. This habit becomes so strong that we project the feeling of expectation onto the events themselves, imagining that they are necessarily connected. The idea of causal necessity, therefore, reflects the psychological force of our own mental habits rather than any objective property of the events we observe. We cannot help feeling that effects must follow from their causes because our minds are structured to form strong expectations based on past experience. This psychological account of causation had profound implications for how we understand scientific laws and natural explanations. Instead of describing mysterious forces that govern the behavior of physical objects, scientific laws simply describe regular patterns that have been observed in past experience. The law of gravitational attraction does not explain why objects fall by appealing to some hidden gravitational force. It merely describes the mathematical regularity with which objects have fallen in previous observations. Similarly, chemical laws do not reveal the essential nature of material substances, but rather summarize consistent patterns in how different substances have behaved when combined under various conditions. Science, from this perspective, is fundamentally descriptive rather than explanatory, concerned with cataloguing regularities in experience rather than uncovering the ultimate causes that govern natural phenomena. This view anticipated many developments in 20th century philosophy of science that emphasized the predictive and instrumental value of scientific theories over their metaphysical truth. Hume also explored the implications of his causal analysis for human action and moral responsibility. If causation is simply regular succession rather than necessary connection, then what does it mean to say that human choices cause human actions? Hume argued that human behavior exhibits the same kind of regularity that we observe in physical events, suggesting that psychological causation follows the same pattern as physical causation. People with similar characters in similar situations tend to behave in similar ways, creating predictable patterns that allow us to understand and anticipate human conduct. But this regularity does not depend on any mysterious causal forces operating within the human mind, any more than physical regularity depends on mysterious forces operating within physical objects. Both psychological and physical causation involve nothing more than the constant conjunction of events as experienced by human observers. This naturalistic approach to human behavior raised important questions about moral responsibility and free will. If human actions are causally determined by prior events in the same way that physical events are determined, then in what sense are people responsible for their choices? Hume argued that moral responsibility does not require exemption from causal determination, but rather depends on the right kind of causal determination. People are morally responsible for actions that flow from their own character, desires and deliberative processes, even if these psychological factors are themselves causally determined by prior events. What matters for moral evaluation is not whether human behavior is causally determined, but whether it is determined by the kinds of psychological processes that make moral praise and blame appropriate responses. This compatibilist approach to free will and determinism would influence centuries of later discussion about the relationship between causal explanation and moral evaluation. Part 4. The Critique of Reason. Hume developed what many consider the most systematic and devastating critique of human reason ever attempted by any philosopher. Unlike previous thinkers who had simply assumed that reason could provide certain knowledge about reality, Hume carefully examined what reason can and cannot accomplish when freed from unwarranted assumptions. His investigation revealed that reason is far weaker and more limited than anyone had previously imagined, but also that human beings possess other psychological resources that allow them to navigate the world successfully despite the limitations of rational thought. This analysis fundamentally changed how philosophers think about the relationship between reason, belief, and practical life. Hume distinguished between two different kinds of reasoning that operate in fundamentally different ways. Demonstrative reasoning deals with relations between ideas and can achieve genuine certainty through logical analysis alone. Mathematical proofs exemplify this kind of reasoning because they reveal necessary connections between concepts that cannot be denied without contradiction. When we prove that the sum of angles in any triangle equals 180 degrees, we discover a truth that must hold for all possible triangles simply by virtue of what we mean by triangle and angle. This kind of reasoning is completely reliable within its proper domain, but its domain is limited to abstract relationships between concepts rather than facts about the actual world. Demonstrative reasoning can tell us what must be true given certain definitions and assumptions, but it cannot tell us whether anything corresponding to those definitions actually exists. Probable reasoning, on the other hand, deals with matters of fact and attempts to draw conclusions about the actual world based on empirical evidence. This kind of reasoning underlies all scientific knowledge, historical investigation, and everyday practical judgment about particular situations. When we conclude that it will probably rain tomorrow based on current weather patterns, or that a particular medicine will likely cure a disease based on clinical trials, we are engaging in probable reasoning. But Hume showed that probable reasoning cannot achieve the certainty that characterizes demonstrative reasoning, because it necessarily involves inferences that go beyond available evidence. Every conclusion about unobserved events requires assumptions about the uniformity of nature that cannot themselves be proven through either logic or experience. Probable reasoning, therefore, rests ultimately on psychological habits rather than rational foundations. This distinction led Hume to a startling conclusion about the scope of rational knowledge. Reason alone can provide certain knowledge only about abstract relationships between concepts, not about the actual nature of reality. All factual knowledge depends on probable reasoning that cannot be rationally justified without circular argument. This means that our beliefs about the external world, the existence of other minds, the reliability of memory, and the continuity of personal identity all rest on natural psychological tendencies rather than rational demonstration. Reason, in other words, is much less powerful than philosophers had traditionally assumed, but human beings possess other mental capacities that allow them to function effectively despite these rational limitations. Understanding these non-rational capacities became central to Hume's project of developing a realistic account of human nature. Hume paid particular attention to the role of belief in human psychology and its relationship to rational evidence. He noticed that belief is not simply a matter of intellectual assent to propositions, but rather involves a distinctive feeling or sentiment that accompanies certain ideas. When you believe that it is raining outside, you do not simply understand the meaning of the proposition that it is raining. You feel a particular psychological attitude toward that proposition that distinguishes it from mere speculation or imagination. This feeling of belief cannot be produced by rational argument alone, but depends on various psychological factors, including the vividness of impressions, the strength of memory, and the force of habit created by repeated experience. Belief, therefore, is more a matter of psychology than logic, involving emotional and instinctive responses that operate independently of rational deliberation. This insight suggested that understanding human knowledge requires studying human psychology rather than abstract logical relationships. The weakness of reason becomes especially apparent when Hume examined its role in motivating human action. Traditional philosophical approaches had assumed that reason could determine not only what we should believe, but also what we should do. Moral philosophers argued that rational reflection could reveal objective moral truths that would necessarily motivate virtuous behavior in anyone who understood them properly. But Hume argued that reason by itself is completely incapable of motivating any action whatsoever. Reason can discover relationships between ideas and calculate the most efficient means for achieving desired goals, but it cannot determine what those goals should be in the first place. The ultimate sources of human motivation are the passions, emotions, and desires that provide the energy and direction for all human activity. This led Hume to his most famous pronouncement about the relationship between reason and passion. Reason, he declared, is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. This striking metaphor suggested that reason functions primarily as an instrument for satisfying emotional and motivational states that have their origins outside the rational faculty itself. Reason can help us figure out how to get what we want, but it cannot tell us what we should want. It can reveal contradictions in our beliefs and calculate the consequences of our actions, but it cannot provide the ultimate values and goals that give direction to human life. This instrumental view of reason challenged centuries of philosophical tradition that had viewed rational reflection as the highest and most authoritative aspect of human nature. Hume's critique of reason also extended to its supposed ability to establish religious and metaphysical truths. Philosophers had long claimed that pure reason could demonstrate the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, and the ultimate nature of reality through sophisticated arguments that required no empirical evidence. But when Hume subjected these arguments to careful analysis using his empirical principles, he found that they all depended on concepts that could not be traced back to sensory experience or logical relationships that involved illegitimate inferences. The cosmological argument for God's existence, for example, assumes that every event must have a cause, but then arbitrarily exempts God from this universal requirement. The ontological argument attempts to deduce real existence from conceptual analysis, but existence is not a property that can be established through definition alone. These and similar arguments fail not because they reach false conclusions, but because they violate the proper limits of what reason can accomplish when confined to legitimate evidence and valid inference. Despite this systematic critique of reason's limitations, Hume did not embrace wholesale skepticism or irrationalism. He recognized that human beings cannot actually live according to the skeptical conclusions that philosophical reasoning reaches when pushed to its logical extreme. Even the most committed philosophical skeptic continues to believe in the external world, trust their memory, and expect the future to resemble the past in their practical daily life. This suggests that skeptical philosophy reveals something important about the limits of rational justification, but it does not undermine the natural beliefs that guide human behavior. Hume concluded that the proper response to philosophical skepticism is not despair, but rather a kind of intellectual humility that recognizes both the power and the limits of human rational capacities. We should follow reason as far as it can legitimately take us, but we should not expect it to answer questions that lie beyond its proper scope. Part 5. Skepticism and Natural Belief. Hume developed one of the most sophisticated treatments of philosophical skepticism in the history of human thought, neither dismissing skeptical arguments as mere sophistry nor accepting them as reasons for intellectual paralysis. Instead, he showed how skeptical reasoning reveals important truths about human knowledge, while simultaneously demonstrating its own practical irrelevance to actual human life. His analysis of skepticism became a model for understanding the complex relationship between philosophical reflection and natural human psychology. The result was a nuanced position that took skeptical challenges seriously while maintaining confidence in the natural beliefs that guide practical action. Ancient skeptical arguments had traditionally focused on the unreliability of sensory experience and the possibility that our perceptions might systematically deceive us about the nature of reality. Skeptics pointed out that objects appear different depending on viewing conditions, that illusions and hallucinations sometimes occur, and that we have no way of stepping outside our own experience to compare our perceptions with reality itself. These arguments suggested that we can never be certain that our senses provide accurate information about the external world. But Hume realized that this ancient skepticism did not go far enough because it still assumed that reason itself was reliable and that logical argument could establish important truths about the limits of knowledge. He developed what he called a more thorough and systematic skepticism that questioned not only the reliability of the senses, but also the authority of reason itself. This deeper skepticism revealed that even our most basic logical and mathematical beliefs rest on psychological foundations that cannot be rationally justified. Hume's analysis of induction provided the foundation for this deeper skeptical challenge. He had shown that all reasoning about matters of fact depends ultimately on the assumption that the future will resemble the past, but that this assumption cannot be justified through either logic or experience without circular reasoning. This means that even our most careful scientific investigations and everyday practical judgments rest on a faith in natural uniformity that has no rational foundation. We cannot prove that the laws of logic will continue to operate tomorrow as they operate today, or that mathematical relationships will remain constant over time. If we push skeptical reasoning to its logical conclusion, we must acknowledge that virtually everything we believe about the world rests on assumptions that cannot be rationally defended. This includes not only our beliefs about external objects, but also our confidence in memory, reasoning, and personal identity. But Hume made a remarkable discovery about what happens when skeptical reasoning reaches these extreme conclusions. He found that the human mind simply cannot sustain such radical doubt for any significant period of time. Even while engaged in the most sophisticated skeptical arguments, people continue to trust their senses, rely on their memory, and expect natural patterns to continue. The very activity of skeptical reasoning requires confidence in logical principles, memory of previous arguments, and belief in the continued existence of other minds capable of understanding philosophical discussion. Skeptical philosophy, therefore, undermines itself by depending on the very beliefs that it calls into question. This led Hume to conclude that skeptical arguments might be intellectually impressive, but they have no genuine power to alter human behavior or undermine natural confidence in basic beliefs. Hume described his own experience of this tension between skeptical reasoning and natural belief with remarkable psychological insight. When engaged in philosophical reflection in his study, he could follow skeptical arguments to their logical conclusion and feel the full force of radical doubt about the external world and personal identity. But as soon as he left his study and engaged in ordinary social activities like dining with friends or playing backgammon, these philosophical doubts completely disappeared, and natural confidence in basic beliefs automatically returned. This alternation between philosophical doubt and natural certainty revealed something important about the structure of human psychology. Skeptical reflection can temporarily weaken our confidence in particular beliefs, but it cannot permanently eliminate the psychological mechanisms that generate these beliefs in the first place. Natural belief operates at a deeper level of human psychology than conscious, rational reflection, and continues to function even when reason calls its foundations into question. This insight led Hume to distinguish between two different kinds of mental processes that operate according to different principles. Philosophical reasoning follows the rules of logic and evidence, pushing arguments to their ultimate conclusions regardless of their practical implications. Natural belief, on the other hand, follows psychological principles that have been shaped by evolutionary pressures to promote survival and successful interaction with the environment. These natural psychological mechanisms automatically generate confidence in the external world, the reliability of memory, the continuity of personal identity, and the uniformity of natural patterns. They operate instinctively and immediately without requiring conscious deliberation or rational justification. Most importantly, they continue to operate even when philosophical reflection reveals that their foundations cannot be rationally defended. Hume argued that this psychological analysis resolves the practical problem of skepticism without ignoring its intellectual significance. Skeptical arguments reveal important truths about the limits of rational justification and the ultimate foundations of human knowledge. They show that our most basic beliefs rest on psychological mechanisms rather than logical demonstrations, and they encourage intellectual humility about the scope of what reason can accomplish. But they do not provide reasons for abandoning these beliefs or attempting to live according to skeptical conclusions. The proper response to skepticism is neither dogmatic dismissal nor paralyzing doubt, but rather a kind of mitigated skepticism that acknowledges both the power and the limits of skeptical reasoning. We should remain open to skeptical insights while continuing to trust the natural beliefs that make practical life possible. This approach to skepticism had profound implications for how Hume thought about the relationship between philosophy and ordinary life. Philosophy at its best reveals important truths about human nature and the structure of human knowledge, but it cannot and should not attempt to replace the natural psychological mechanisms that guide practical behavior. The value of philosophical reflection lies not in providing alternative foundations for belief, but in deepening our understanding of why we believe what we believe and how our cognitive capacities actually function. This naturalistic approach to philosophy emphasized the importance of studying human psychology and social behavior rather than constructing abstract metaphysical systems. It suggested that the most important philosophical questions concern not the ultimate nature of reality, but the natural history of human opinion and the psychological mechanisms that govern belief formation. This shift from metaphysical to psychological concerns would profoundly influence later developments in philosophy, psychology, and social science. Part 6. The bundle theory of mind. When Hume turned his empirical method toward the analysis of human consciousness and personal identity, he made discoveries that shocked even himself and challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of the self that had dominated Western thought for centuries. His investigation into what makes you the same person from moment to moment and year to year led him to conclude that the self, as traditionally conceived, is a philosophical fiction rather than an empirical reality. This insight had profound implications not only for philosophy and psychology, but also for how we think about moral responsibility, personal development, and the meaning of individual existence. Hume's analysis of the mind remains one of his most psychologically penetrating and practically significant contributions to human self-understanding. Traditional philosophical and religious approaches to personal identity had assumed the existence of some permanent, unchanging substance or soul that serves as the foundation of individual consciousness. This substantial self was thought to persist through all the changes of experience, providing the stable core that makes you the same person despite the constant flux of your thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. Philosophers debated whether this substantial self was material or immaterial, simple or complex, mortal or immortal, but they generally agreed that some such entity must exist to account for the unity and continuity of personal experience. Without a permanent self, they argued, there could be no genuine personal identity, no moral responsibility, and no meaningful individual existence. But when Hume applied his empirical principles to the analysis of consciousness, he made a startling discovery about what introspective investigation actually reveals. He invited readers to examine their own minds carefully and report what they found when they looked for this supposed permanent self. When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, Hume reported, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. In other words, careful introspective analysis reveals only a constantly changing stream of particular mental contents, never the permanent self that was supposed to be experiencing these contents. Consciousness consists entirely of particular perceptions that arise and pass away, with no underlying substance or ego that persists through these changes. This led Hume to his famous bundle theory of the mind, one of the most radical proposals in the history of psychology and philosophy. Instead of being a substantial entity that has experiences, the mind simply is the collection of experiences themselves, bound together by various psychological principles, but lacking any permanent foundation. The self is nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement. There is no theatre of consciousness where perceptions appear, no audience observing the mental drama, and no permanent resident of the mind who endures through psychological changes. What we call the self is really just the stream of consciousness itself, the ongoing flow of thoughts, sensations, emotions and memories that constitutes our mental life. Personal identity from this perspective is not grounded in metaphysical substance, but created by psychological processes that connect different mental events over time. Hume identified several psychological mechanisms that create the illusion of substantial selfhood by binding separate mental events into apparently unified personal histories. The principle of resemblance connects similar mental contents across time, creating psychological continuity even when exact repetition does not occur. When you remember yesterday's experience of seeing a red rose, the memory resembles but does not exactly duplicate the original perception. Yet the resemblance creates a sense of connection between past and present mental states. The principle of causation connects mental events that seem to influence or produce other mental events, creating the impression of a unified psychological system operating through time. Your current desire to write a letter causes you to remember where you left your pen, which causes you to walk to your desk, creating a causal chain that unifies otherwise separate mental episodes. Most importantly, memory creates connections between distant past experiences and present consciousness, allowing you to construct a personal narrative that spans years or decades of lived experience. But Hume emphasized that these psychological connections do not require or imply the existence of any permanent substantial self. The unity of consciousness is created by natural psychological processes that operate automatically and instinctively, not by any underlying metaphysical entity. Just as a river maintains its identity over time despite consisting of constantly changing water, personal identity persists through constantly changing mental contents by virtue of psychological continuity rather than substantial permanence. The mistake of traditional philosophy was to assume that psychological unity requires metaphysical substance, when in fact it can be fully explained by natural psychological principles operating on constantly changing mental materials. This analysis had profound implications for how Hume thought about moral responsibility and personal development. If the self is not a fixed substance, but an ongoing process of psychological change, then people are not permanently locked into particular character traits or behavioral patterns. Personal identity involves enough continuity to make moral evaluation meaningful, but enough flexibility to make genuine moral improvement possible. You're responsible for your past actions because they flow from psychological processes that connect to your present mental state. But you are not condemned to repeat past mistakes because your character itself can evolve through new experiences and deliberate effort. This process view of personal identity encouraged both moral responsibility and hope for personal growth by showing how individuals can take active roles in shaping their own psychological development. The self is not something you simply have, but something you continuously create through the choices you make and the habits you cultivate. Hume also explored the social dimensions of personal identity formation, recognizing that individual psychology develops through interaction with other people and cultural institutions. Our sense of ourselves as unified persons depends partly on how others perceive and respond to us over time. Social recognition provides external reinforcement for the internal psychological processes that create personal continuity, while social roles and relationships offer frameworks within which individual identity can develop and stabilize. The self, therefore, is not only a psychological bundle, but also a social construction that emerges through participation in human communities. This insight anticipated much later developments in social psychology and sociology that emphasized the social foundations of individual identity. It also suggested that understanding personal identity requires attention to cultural and historical contexts that shape how individuals understand themselves and their place in the world. Despite the radical implications of the bundle theory, Hume acknowledged that it conflicted with natural human psychology in ways that created persistent philosophical puzzles. People cannot help feeling that they are unified, persistent selves who endure through psychological changes, even when philosophical reflection suggests that this feeling has no metaphysical foundation. This created what Hume called one of the deepest and most troubling problems in his entire philosophical system. The bundle theory seemed to be supported by empirical analysis of consciousness, but it conflicted so strongly with natural psychological tendencies that even Hume found it difficult to maintain consistent belief in his own conclusion. This tension between philosophical reasoning and natural psychology revealed the complexity of human self-understanding and the difficulty of reconciling different approaches to fundamental questions about personal identity. It also illustrated Hume's intellectual honesty in acknowledging the limitations and problems in his own philosophical system, rather than defending it dogmatically against all objections. Part 7. The Passions and Human Motivation. Hume developed the most systematic and psychologically sophisticated analysis of human emotion and motivation that had ever been attempted in the history of philosophy. Unlike previous thinkers who had viewed the passions as disruptive forces that interfere with rational thought, Hume argued that emotional and motivational states provide the fundamental energy that drives all human activity. His detailed investigation into the psychology of the passions revealed the complex mechanisms through which human beings form attachments, pursue goals, and navigate social relationships. This analysis became the foundation for his entire approach to moral philosophy and social theory, showing how human institutions and practices emerge from natural psychological tendencies rather than abstract rational principles. Hume distinguished between two fundamentally different kinds of mental phenomena that operate according to different psychological principles. Impressions and ideas involve the cognitive processing of sensory information and memory, while passions involve emotional and motivational responses that energize and direct human behavior. The passions do not simply add feeling to otherwise neutral cognitive states. They provide the ultimate source of all human action by creating desires, aversions, hopes, fears, and other motivational attitudes that give direction to human life. Without the passions, Hume argued, human beings would be purely passive observers of their own mental contents, capable of receiving and processing information, but incapable of being moved to any kind of action whatsoever. Reason can discover relationships between ideas and calculate means to ends, but only passion can supply the ends themselves and the motivation to pursue them. This made the study of the passions central to understanding human nature and social behavior. Hume further divided the passions into several distinct categories that operate according to different psychological mechanisms. Direct passions arise immediately from the perception of good and evil, pleasure and pain, without requiring complex cognitive mediation. When you touch something hot, you immediately feel pain and develop an aversion to touching that object again. This direct emotional response requires no sophisticated reasoning or social learning. Indirect passions, on the other hand, arise through more complex psychological processes that involve judgments about relationships between yourself, other people, and various objects or situations. Pride and humility, love and hatred, and other social emotions require sophisticated cognitive processing that takes into account not only immediate pleasures and pains, but also social comparisons, causal relationships, and cultural values. These indirect passions play crucial roles in social life by motivating people to seek approval, avoid disapproval, form attachments, and maintain their social standing within human communities. The indirect passion of pride provided Hume with a particularly revealing case study in the psychology of human emotion. Pride arises when we perceive some positive quality or achievement that belongs to us and that we believe others will find impressive or admirable. The psychological mechanism of pride involves a complex association of ideas and impressions that connects the self, some external object or achievement, and the pleasant feeling that accompanies social recognition. When you feel proud of your house, for example, your mind associates the idea of yourself with the idea of your beautiful house and with the pleasant feeling that comes from imagining how others will respond to your good taste. This creates a complex emotional state that involves not only immediate pleasure, but also social comparison and self-evaluation in relation to community standards. Pride thus reveals how individual psychology is fundamentally social, involving constant reference to the opinions and reactions of other people. Humility operates as the direct opposite of pride, arising when we perceive negative qualities or failures that belong to us and that we believe others will find unimpressive or contemptible. The same psychological mechanisms that generate pride in response to positive associations generate humility in response to negative associations. But Hume noticed something important about the relationship between these opposing emotions. Both pride and humility involve self-evaluation in relation to social standards, suggesting that individual self-understanding is fundamentally comparative and social rather than purely private and introspective. We understand ourselves primarily by imagining how we appear to others and by measuring our achievements against social expectations and community standards. This insight anticipated much later research in social psychology about the social construction of self-concept and the importance of social comparison in human psychology. Love and hatred operate according to similar psychological principles, but focus on other people rather than on the self. Love arises when we associate another person with positive qualities or achievements that create pleasant feelings and attract our attention and attachment. Hatred arises when we associate another person with negative qualities or actions that create unpleasant feelings and generate aversion or hostility. But Hume emphasized that love and hatred, like pride and humility, are not simply automatic responses to positive and negative qualities in other people. They depend on complex cognitive processing that takes into account causal relationships, social contexts, and cultural values. We are more likely to love people whose positive qualities seem to result from their own efforts rather than from lucky accidents, and we are more likely to hate people whose negative actions seem to flow from their character rather than from external circumstances. Hume's analysis of the passions led him to several important conclusions about human motivation and moral psychology. First, he showed that all human action ultimately depends on emotional and motivational states that cannot be justified through reason alone. Our most basic goals and values reflect natural human sentiments rather than rational demonstrations, which means that moral and political philosophy must take seriously the psychology of human emotion rather than attempting to derive practical conclusions from abstract rational principles. Second, he demonstrated that individual psychology is fundamentally social, involving constant interaction with other people and sensitivity to community standards and expectations. This suggested that understanding human behavior requires attention to social contexts and cultural frameworks rather than focusing exclusively on individual mental processes. Third, he revealed the complex cognitive processing that underlies even apparently simple emotional responses, showing that human psychology involves sophisticated mechanisms for evaluating social relationships and navigating complex social environments. These insights about the passions became the foundation for Hume's approach to moral philosophy and social theory. If human action depends ultimately on natural sentiments rather than rational argument, then moral philosophy should focus on understanding and cultivating the emotional responses that promote human flourishing rather than attempting to derive moral conclusions from abstract logical principles. If individual psychology is fundamentally social, then political institutions should be designed to work with natural human psychology rather than expecting people to transcend their emotional and social nature. This naturalistic approach to ethics and politics emphasized the importance of empirical investigation into human psychology and social behavior, treating moral and political questions as fundamentally scientific problems about human nature and social organization. Part 8. Moral Sentiments and the Foundation of Ethics. Hume revolutionized moral philosophy by shifting attention from abstract rational principles to the natural psychological mechanisms that actually govern human ethical behavior. Instead of asking what moral rules can be derived from reason alone, he investigated how human beings actually make moral judgments and what psychological processes motivate moral behavior. His empirical approach to ethics revealed that moral judgments express natural human sentiments rather than objective truths about reality. But he argued that this psychological foundation makes morality more rather than less important for human life. Understanding the sentimental basis of ethics became the key to developing more realistic and effective approaches to moral education, social policy, and personal character development. When Hume examined his own moral judgments and invited others to examine theirs, he made a crucial discovery about the psychological structure of ethical evaluation. Moral judgments involve a distinctive kind of emotional response that is different from ordinary personal preferences or aesthetic tastes. When you judge that murder is wrong, you are not simply expressing dislike for murder in the way that you might express dislike for Brussels sprouts or classical music. Moral disapproval involves what Hume called a sentiment of disapprobation that has a universal and social character that distinguishes it from purely personal preferences. You disapprove of murder not only when it affects you personally, but also when it occurs in distant places or historical periods that have no direct impact on your own interests. This suggests that moral sentiments involve a kind of impartial sympathy that extends beyond narrow self-interest to encompass the welfare of humanity in general. Hume argued that this capacity for moral sentiment depends on natural human psychology that has been shaped by evolutionary and social pressures to promote cooperation and mutual aid. Human beings are naturally equipped with sympathetic mechanisms that allow them to share vicariously in the pleasures and pains of other people. When you observe someone experiencing joy or suffering, you automatically tend to feel similar emotions yourself, though usually with less intensity than the person directly involved. This sympathetic response is not learned through moral education or rational argument, but operates instinctively and immediately, creating emotional connections between individuals that motivate concern for others' welfare. Moral sentiments build on these natural sympathetic responses by extending and refining them through social interaction and cultural development. The capacity for sympathy provides the psychological foundation that makes moral evaluation possible, while social experience shapes how these natural capacities are expressed in particular cultural contexts. But Hume recognized that natural sympathy alone cannot account for the complex structure of mature moral judgment. Sympathy tends to be stronger for people who are closer to us in space, time, and social relationship, while moral judgment claims to be impartial and universal in its scope. We sympathize more intensely with family members than with strangers, with contemporaries than with people from distant historical periods, and with people who share our cultural background than with people from different societies. But moral judgment often requires us to override these natural biases and evaluate actions from a more impartial perspective that takes into account the interests of all affected parties. This led Hume to investigate the psychological mechanisms through which natural sympathy is refined and extended to support more sophisticated forms of moral evaluation. He discovered that moral judgment involves adopting what he called a general point of view that corrects for the natural limitations and biases of immediate sympathetic response. The general point of view represents a kind of psychological abstraction from immediate personal interests and relationships that allows moral evaluation to achieve greater impartiality and consistency. When making moral judgments, we imaginatively adopt the perspective of an impartial observer who considers the effects of actions on all affected parties without giving special weight to personal relationships or interests. This psychological process does not eliminate the role of sentiment in moral judgment, but rather refines and extends natural sympathetic responses to create more reliable and socially useful forms of moral evaluation. The general point of view allows us to approve of actions that promote general human welfare, even when they conflict with our immediate personal interests, and to disapprove of actions that cause unnecessary suffering, even when they benefit us personally. This capacity for impartial moral judgment emerges naturally from social interaction and communication, as individuals discover that consistent moral standards promote social cooperation and mutual understanding. Societies that develop effective mechanisms for moral evaluation gain advantages in solving collective problems and maintaining social order. Hume's analysis of moral sentiment led him to important conclusions about the relationship between individual psychology and social institutions. Moral standards are not arbitrary social conventions imposed on unwilling individuals, but they also are not objective truths that exist independently of human psychology and social experience. Instead, moral standards represent the natural development of human sympathetic capacities as refined and extended through social interaction and cultural learning. This means that effective moral education should focus on cultivating and extending natural human sympathies, rather than attempting to impose abstract rational principles through authoritarian methods. Children learn to make moral judgments not primarily through memorizing rules, but through participating in social relationships that develop their capacity for sympathy and their understanding of how actions affect human welfare. Similarly, social institutions should be designed to work with natural human psychology by creating incentives and opportunities for the expression of moral sentiment, rather than expecting people to transcend their emotional nature entirely. This sentimental approach to ethics also had important implications for how Hume thought about moral disagreement and cultural variation in ethical standards. If moral judgments express natural human sentiments that have been refined through social experience, then we should expect some variation in moral standards across different societies, while also expecting some underlying common themes that reflect shared human psychology. All human societies develop prohibitions against unprovoked violence, requirements for honesty and social cooperation, and expectations of care for children and other vulnerable members of the community. But different societies may develop different specific rules and practices for expressing these underlying moral concerns, depending on their particular history, environment, and social organization. This suggests that moral philosophy should focus on identifying the natural human sentiments that provide universal foundations for ethics, while remaining open to legitimate cultural variation in how these sentiments are expressed and institutionalized. Dogmatic insistence on particular moral rules without attention to their psychological foundations and social context is likely to be both ineffective and harmful to human flourishing. Hume's moral philosophy thus offered a middle path between moral relativism and moral absolutism that emphasized both the natural foundations and the social development of ethical judgment. Moral standards are not simply matters of personal opinion or cultural preference because they are grounded in universal human psychology that creates genuine constraints on what kinds of ethical systems can promote human flourishing. But moral standards are also not eternal metaphysical truths that can be discovered through pure reason, because they depend on natural human sentiments that have been shaped by evolutionary and social pressures. The proper approach to moral philosophy involves empirical investigation into human psychology and social behaviour, combined with practical efforts to cultivate the natural capacities that support moral judgment and behaviour. This naturalistic approach to ethics anticipated many later developments in moral psychology, evolutionary ethics, and applied ethics that emphasized the importance of understanding human nature for developing effective approaches to moral education and social policy. It remains one of Hume's most influential and practically significant contributions to human self-understanding. Part 9. The Is-Ought Problem. Hume identified what many philosophers consider the most fundamental logical problem in all of moral philosophy, a puzzle that continues to challenge anyone who attempts to derive ethical conclusions from factual premises. This problem concerns the logical relationship between descriptive statements about what is the case and normative statements about what ought to be the case. Hume noticed that there seems to be an unbridgeable logical gap between these two kinds of statements, such that no amount of factual information can by itself generate moral conclusions without additional normative premises. This insight, now known as the Is-Ought problem or Hume's guillotine, fundamentally changed how philosophers think about the relationship between science and ethics, reason and values, and fact and opinion. The problem becomes clear when we examine typical examples of moral reasoning that attempt to derive normative conclusions from purely factual premises. Someone might argue that stealing is wrong because it causes suffering to the victims, reduces social trust, and undermines economic cooperation. All of these claims about the effects of stealing might be empirically true, but Hume pointed out that they do not by themselves establish that stealing is morally wrong, unless we already accept additional normative premises about the moral significance of suffering, trust, and cooperation. The factual claim that stealing causes suffering becomes a moral argument against stealing only if we also accept the normative principle that causing unnecessary suffering is morally wrong. But this normative principle cannot itself be derived from purely factual observations without introducing additional normative assumptions that raise the same logical problem. Every attempt to derive ought from requires smuggling in normative premises that cannot themselves be justified through purely factual reasoning. Hume illustrated this logical problem by examining the structure of moral arguments more carefully. In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, he observed, the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning, establishing facts about human nature, social relationships, or natural consequences of actions. But then all of a sudden, I'm surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. This change is imperceptible, but represents a logical leap that cannot be justified through the same kinds of reasoning that established the original factual premises. The move from descriptive to normative language introduces new kinds of concepts that require different kinds of justification, yet most moral philosophers simply assume that this transition is unproblematic. Hume demanded that moral philosophers explain how this logical transition is supposed to work and what kinds of reasoning can legitimately connect factual premises to moral conclusions. This logical analysis had profound implications for how Hume thought about the relationship between scientific knowledge and moral evaluation. Science excels at discovering factual truths about natural and social phenomena, but it cannot by itself determine what moral attitudes we should adopt toward these phenomena. Empirical investigation can reveal the causes and consequences of human actions, the psychological mechanisms that govern moral judgment, and the social effects of different ethical systems. But all of this factual knowledge leaves open the fundamental question of what moral standards we should accept and what values should guide our individual and collective choices. Science can inform moral judgment by clarifying the likely consequences of different courses of action, but it cannot replace moral judgment by providing objective answers to normative questions. This suggests that ethics and science address fundamentally different kinds of questions that require different kinds of intellectual methods and cannot be reduced to each other. Hume's analysis also revealed important features of moral language and moral psychology that had previously been overlooked. Moral judgments do not simply describe natural or social facts, but express distinctive attitudes of approval and disapproval that involve emotional and motivational elements. When you say that honesty is good or that cruelty is bad, you are not merely reporting your observations about the effects of honest or cruel behavior. You are also expressing your own moral sentiments and attempting to influence the moral sentiments of other people in ways that might affect future behavior. Moral language has what contemporary philosophers call both descriptive and prescriptive functions, providing information about moral attitudes while also attempting to shape moral attitudes. Understanding this dual function of moral language helps explain why moral disagreement often seems more emotionally charged and practically significant than disagreement about purely factual matters. The is-ought problem also had important implications for Hume's thinking about the limits and proper scope of rational argument in moral contexts. If moral conclusions cannot be derived from factual premises through logical reasoning alone, then rational argument plays a more limited role in moral judgment than traditional philosophers had assumed. Reason can clarify concepts, identify logical inconsistencies, predict consequences, and reveal previously unnoticed features of moral situations. But reason cannot by itself generate the fundamental values and commitments that provide the normative premises for moral reasoning. These basic moral attitudes must come from other sources, particularly the natural human sentiments and social processes that Hume had analyzed in his theory of moral psychology. This does not mean that moral judgment is irrational or arbitrary, but rather that it depends on psychological and social foundations that operate according to different principles than logical demonstration. Hume's solution to the is-ought problem involved shifting attention from the logical derivation of moral conclusions to the psychological and social processes through which moral attitudes actually develop and function. Instead of asking how moral judgments can be rationally justified, he asked how moral judgments actually arise in human experience and what psychological and social functions they serve. This approach suggested that the most important questions for moral philosophy concern not the logical foundations of ethics, but the natural history of moral sentiment and the social conditions that promote or hinder the development of moral attitudes that contribute to human flourishing. Moral philosophy, from this perspective, becomes a branch of empirical psychology and social science rather than an abstract, logical enterprise that attempts to derive normative conclusions from rational principles alone. This naturalistic approach to the is-ought problem anticipated many later developments in moral philosophy that emphasized the importance of understanding moral psychology, social evolution, and cultural variation in ethical systems. Contemporary moral philosophers continue to struggle with the logical problem that Hume identified, but many have adopted his suggestion that moral philosophy should focus primarily on understanding how moral judgment actually works, rather than attempting to provide ultimate rational foundations for moral conclusions. This shift has led to productive research programs in moral psychology, evolutionary ethics, experimental philosophy, and applied ethics that emphasize empirical investigation into moral behavior and practical efforts to promote moral attitudes that contribute to individual and social flourishing. Hume's analysis of the is-ought problem thus continues to influence contemporary discussions about the relationship between science and ethics, the nature of moral reasoning, and the proper methods for moral philosophy. Part 10. Justice and the Artificial Virtues. Hume developed a revolutionary analysis of justice and social institutions that showed how complex moral and political arrangements can emerge naturally from simple psychological mechanisms without requiring central planning or rational design. His investigation into what he called the artificial virtues revealed how human beings create stable systems of property, government and law through gradual social learning rather than explicit agreement or authoritarian imposition. This approach to social philosophy emphasized the importance of understanding the natural psychological and social processes that generate moral and political institutions, rather than attempting to derive ideal political arrangements from abstract, rational principles. Hume's analysis of justice became the foundation for later social theories that emphasized spontaneous order, cultural evolution, and the unintended consequences of human action. Hume distinguished between two fundamentally different kinds of moral virtues that operate according to different psychological principles and serve different social functions. Natural virtues like benevolence, gratitude, and compassion arise directly from natural human sentiments and motivate morally appropriate behavior without requiring complex social learning or institutional support. When you feel sympathy for someone in distress and act to help them, you are expressing a natural virtue that flows immediately from your emotional response to their situation. These natural virtues are universal across human societies because they reflect basic features of human psychology that do not depend on particular cultural arrangements or social institutions. Artificial virtues, on the other hand, are moral attitudes and practices that develop only within particular social contexts and depend on complex systems of mutual expectations and shared understanding. Justice, honesty in economic transactions, political loyalty, and respect for property rights are artificial virtues that emerge through social interaction and cultural learning rather than immediate emotional response. The artificial virtue of justice provides the most important example of how complex moral institutions can emerge from simple psychological mechanisms without conscious design or rational planning. Hume asked why human beings develop systems of property rights that restrict individual liberty and prevent people from taking whatever they want or need from the common stock of goods available in their environment. The answer, he argued, lies not in any natural moral sense or rational principle, but in the gradual recognition that mutual restraint in the acquisition and use of material goods serves everyone's long-term interests better than unrestricted competition. In small groups with abundant resources, people can share freely and resolve conflicts through personal relationships and immediate reciprocity. But as societies grow larger and resources become scarcer, unrestricted competition for material goods creates conflicts that threaten everyone's security and prosperity. Under these conditions, people gradually learn that mutual adherence to rules governing the acquisition and transfer of property creates benefits for all participants that outweigh the costs of individual restraint. This learning process does not require explicit negotiation or formal agreement about property rules. Instead, it emerges through a gradual process of social interaction in which individuals discover that certain patterns of behavior promote mutual cooperation while other patterns lead to conflict and mutual disadvantage. When people consistently respect each other's possessions and honor agreements about the transfer of goods, they create an environment of social trust that encourages productive activity and voluntary exchange. When people frequently violate these expectations, social cooperation breaks down and everyone becomes worse off as they must devote more time and energy to protecting their resources rather than creating new wealth. Over time, successful societies develop increasingly sophisticated systems of property rights, contract law, and dispute resolution that build on these simple psychological tendencies toward reciprocal cooperation. These institutional developments represent collective learning about social arrangements that promote human flourishing, not the implementation of abstract moral principles or rational social contracts. Hume emphasized that the artificial virtue of justice depends on what he called a convention that emerges gradually through social interaction rather than explicit agreement. A convention, in Hume's technical sense, is a stable pattern of mutual expectations and coordinated behavior that serves everyone's interests without requiring central coordination or enforcement. Consider how people learn to drive on the same side of the road in a particular society. There is nothing inherently right or wrong about driving on the left side versus the right side, but everyone benefits when everyone follows the same rule consistently. This coordination emerges naturally as people discover the advantages of predictable behavior patterns, and it becomes self-sustaining because deviation from the established pattern creates disadvantages for the individual who deviates. Similarly, systems of property rights emerge as social conventions that coordinate individual behavior in ways that promote mutual advantage, and they become self-sustaining because violation of established property rules creates disadvantages for violators, while adherence creates advantages for everyone. The conventional nature of justice has important implications for how we think about moral disagreement and cultural variation in legal and political systems. Because justice is an artificial virtue that depends on social conventions rather than natural moral sentiments, we should expect significant variation across societies in the specific rules and institutions that govern property, contracts, and political authority. Different societies may develop different but equally legitimate approaches to organizing economic activity and political decision-making depending on their particular history, environment, and cultural resources. This does not mean that all social arrangements are equally good or that moral criticism of political institutions is inappropriate. Some institutional arrangements promote human flourishing more effectively than others. An empirical investigation can help identify the social conditions that encourage the development of beneficial institutions. But it does mean that moral and political philosophy should focus on understanding the natural processes through which institutions develop and change, rather than attempting to derive ideal political arrangements from abstract rational principles that ignore psychological and social realities. Hume's analysis of artificial virtues also revealed important features of moral education and social policy that had practical significance for political reform and individual character development. Because artificial virtues depend on social conventions that must be learned through social interaction, Moral education should focus on helping people understand the social functions of moral and legal institutions, rather than simply demanding obedience to abstract rules. People are more likely to respect property rights, honour contracts and follow laws when they understand how these institutions serve their own long-term interests and contribute to general social welfare. Similarly, political reform should focus on modifying institutions gradually in ways that build on existing social conventions, rather than attempting to impose entirely new systems that conflict with established patterns of social cooperation. Revolutionary changes that ignore the conventional foundations of social order are likely to destroy beneficial institutions without successfully replacing them with better alternatives. Effective reform requires understanding the natural social processes through which institutions develop and adapting these processes to promote human flourishing more effectively. This approach to justice and social institutions anticipated many later developments in social theory, economics and political science that emphasized the importance of understanding social evolution, spontaneous order, and the unintended consequences of human action. Hume's insights about the conventional nature of justice influenced economists who studied how market institutions emerge and evolve without central planning, political scientists who analyzed the development of democratic institutions, and anthropologists who investigated the cultural evolution of moral and legal systems. His emphasis on the gradual, unplanned emergence of social institutions provided an alternative to both individualistic approaches that ignored social influences on human behavior and collectivistic approaches that treated social institutions as products of conscious, rational design. This middle approach continues to influence contemporary discussions about the proper balance between individual freedom and social cooperation, the role of government in economic activity, and the relationship between moral values and political institutions. Part 11. The Critique of Miracles and Religious Authority. Hume developed what many consider the most devastating critique of miracle claims ever formulated, an argument so logically rigorous and empirically grounded that religious authorities still struggle to answer it nearly 3 centuries later. His analysis of miracles exemplified his broader approach to religious questions, applying empirical principles and probabilistic reasoning to beliefs that had traditionally been accepted on the basis of authority, tradition, or faith alone. The result was not a crude attack on religion, but rather a sophisticated investigation into the psychological and logical foundations of religious belief that revealed fundamental problems with traditional approaches to religious knowledge. Hume's critique of miracles became a model for applying scientific reasoning to religious claims, and helped establish the modern understanding of the relationship between empirical evidence and extraordinary claims. Hume began his analysis by carefully defining what makes a claim about miraculous events different from ordinary empirical claims about natural phenomena. A miracle, he argued, is a violation of the laws of nature brought about by a particular divine intervention or supernatural agency. This definition captures the essential feature that makes miracles religiously significant. They represent direct divine action in the natural world that suspends or overrides the regular patterns of cause and effect that normally govern natural events. But this definition also reveals why miracle claims create special problems for empirical evaluation. If miracles are violations of natural laws, then they are by definition extremely rare events that contradict our most well-established beliefs about how the world normally operates. This rarity is not accidental, but essential to what makes miracles miraculous. If they occurred frequently or predictably, they would simply be part of the natural order rather than supernatural interventions. The logical structure of Hume's argument against miracles emerged from this analysis of what miracle claims actually involve. When someone reports that a miraculous event has occurred, we must choose between two competing explanations for their testimony. Either a genuine miracle has occurred, meaning that the laws of nature have been suspended by supernatural intervention, or the person reporting the miracle is mistaken, deceived, or deliberately lying about what they observed. Hume argued that rational evaluation of miracle claims requires weighing the probability of these two competing explanations based on our general experience of how the world works. We have overwhelming evidence from countless observations that natural laws operate consistently and predictably across all times and places where they have been tested. We also have extensive evidence that human testimony can be unreliable due to limitations of perception, memory and judgment, as well as deliberate deception motivated by various psychological and social factors. Given this background evidence, Hume concluded, rational evaluation will always favour natural explanations over supernatural explanations when evaluating miracle claims. The evidence for the consistency of natural laws is so strong that it creates what Hume called a full proof against any particular miracle claim, meaning that the probability of testimonial error always exceeds the probability of natural law violation. This does not mean that miracles are impossible in some absolute metaphysical sense, only that it is never rational to believe miracle claims based on human testimony alone. A wise person proportions their belief to the evidence, and the evidence will always favour natural explanations because natural explanations are consistent with our most reliable and extensive empirical knowledge, while miracle explanations contradict this knowledge. The more extraordinary the claimed miracle, the stronger the evidence would need to be to make belief rational. But human testimony can never provide evidence strong enough to outweigh our general experience of natural regularity. This creates what appears to be an insurmountable logical barrier to rational belief in miracles based on testimonial evidence. Hume strengthened his argument by examining the historical and psychological circumstances under which miracle claims typically arise. He noticed that miracle stories are most common among ignorant and barbarous peoples who lack sophisticated understanding of natural causes and who are psychologically predisposed to believe in supernatural explanations for unusual events. As societies develop more advanced scientific knowledge and more critical approaches to evaluating evidence, miracle claims become less frequent and less culturally influential. This historical pattern suggests that belief in miracles reflects limited understanding of natural causes rather than genuine supernatural interventions. Hume also pointed out that miracle claims are often associated with the founding of new religions or the promotion of particular religious and political agendas, creating strong motivational incentives for exaggeration, fabrication, or misinterpretation of unusual events. The psychological tendency to find meaning and purpose in unusual coincidences, combined with social pressures to conform to religious expectations, creates conditions that naturally generate miracle stories regardless of whether any genuine supernatural events have occurred. The argument against miracles had broader implications for Hume's approach to religious belief and the relationship between reason and faith. If rational evaluation of evidence cannot support belief in miracles, then religious beliefs that depend on miraculous claims must rest on psychological and social foundations rather than empirical evidence. This does not necessarily make religious belief irrational, but it does mean that religious belief involves psychological commitments that go beyond what empirical evidence can justify. People who maintain religious beliefs despite the logical problems with miracle claims are following natural human tendencies toward meaning-making and social belonging rather than strict logical reasoning. Hume suggested that this psychological analysis provides a more accurate and helpful understanding of religious belief than traditional approaches that attempt to provide rational proofs for religious conclusions. Understanding the psychological functions of religious belief may be more important for human self-understanding than resolving abstract theological questions about the existence or attributes of supernatural beings. Hume's critique of miracles also extended to broader questions about the relationship between historical testimony and rational belief. His analysis revealed general principles for evaluating extraordinary claims that apply far beyond specifically religious contexts. When evaluating any claim that contradicts well-established empirical knowledge, rational inquiry requires weighing the reliability of the sources making the claim against the strength of the evidence that supports the contradicted knowledge. The more extraordinary the claim, the more reliable the sources must be to make belief rational, and no amount of testimonial evidence can justify belief in claims that contradict our most fundamental and well-supported empirical knowledge. This approach to extraordinary claims has become a cornerstone of modern scientific reasoning and critical thinking education, providing a systematic method for distinguishing between legitimate empirical discoveries and unfounded speculation or deception. Hume's analysis of miracles thus contributed not only to religious philosophy, but also to the general methodology of empirical inquiry and rational evaluation of evidence. The philosophical implications of Hume's argument continue to generate discussion and controversy among philosophers, theologians, and scientists. Some critics argue that Hume's approach begs the question against religious belief by assuming that natural laws are inviolable, while defenders argue that his approach simply applies consistent empirical standards to religious claims. Some religious thinkers have responded by developing approaches to religious belief that do not depend on miracle claims, while others have attempted to reformulate the concept of miracles in ways that avoid Hume's logical objections. Contemporary discussions about the relationship between science and religion continue to grapple with the fundamental questions that Hume raised about the proper role of empirical evidence in evaluating religious beliefs and the logical relationship between natural and supernatural explanations. Regardless of one's ultimate conclusions about religious questions, Hume's analysis of miracles remains a model of rigorous philosophical reasoning that demonstrates the importance of applying consistent logical standards to all empirical claims, regardless of their cultural or religious significance. His approach continues to influence how educated people think about the relationship between evidence and belief in contexts far beyond the specific question of religious miracles. Part 12. Political Philosophy and the Science of Government. Hume approached political questions with the same empirical methodology that he applied to all other aspects of human experience, treating government and political institutions as natural phenomena that could be understood through careful observation of human behavior and social organization. Rather than beginning with abstract theories about natural rights, social contracts, or ideal forms of government, he investigated how political institutions actually develop and function in human societies. His political philosophy emphasized the importance of designing institutions that work with natural human psychology rather than expecting people to transcend their psychological limitations through political participation. This realistic approach to politics had profound implications for how we think about constitutional design, the proper scope of government authority, and the relationship between individual liberty and social order. Hume rejected the popular 18th century theory that legitimate government must be based on the explicit consent of the governed expressed through some form of original social contract. When he examined the actual historical origins of existing governments, he found that virtually all political institutions had emerged through conquest, gradual evolution of social customs, or pragmatic responses to particular historical circumstances rather than explicit agreements among free and equal individuals. Most people who live under particular governments never explicitly consented to political authority, but rather found themselves subject to established institutions that preceded their birth and will continue after their death. The social contract theory, Hume argued, describes an imaginary historical event that never actually occurred rather than the real foundations of political obligation and governmental legitimacy. Understanding why people actually obey political authority requires studying the psychological and social processes that generate habits of obedience rather than searching for mythical moments of original consent. This historical and psychological approach to political obligation became the foundation for Hume's entire approach to political philosophy. Instead of consent, Hume argued that political obligation rests primarily on utility and convention, the same psychological and social foundations that support other artificial virtues like justice and promise-keeping. People develop habits of political obedience because they gradually learn that social order promotes their individual interests better than political chaos, even when particular government actions conflict with their immediate desires. This learning process does not require explicit calculation or formal agreement, but emerges naturally through social experience as people discover the practical benefits of predictable legal and political institutions. Political authority becomes legitimate not because people have explicitly consented to it, but because it serves essential social functions that people come to value through experience. Governments that consistently promote general welfare and maintain social order earn the allegiance of their subjects through their practical effectiveness rather than their theoretical foundations. This utilitarian approach to political legitimacy suggested that the proper question for political evaluation is not whether governments conform to abstract moral principles, but whether they promote human flourishing more effectively than available alternatives. Hume's analysis of political psychology revealed important insights about the conditions under which governmental institutions remain stable and effective over time. He identified opinion as the ultimate foundation of all government, arguing that political authority depends more on the psychological attitudes of subjects than on physical force or legal structures. Even the most powerful governments cannot maintain control indefinitely if they lose the habitual obedience and general support of the population they govern. Military and police forces are themselves composed of citizens whose continued loyalty depends on their own opinions about the legitimacy and effectiveness of political institutions. This means that understanding political stability requires studying the formation and change of public opinion rather than focusing exclusively on formal constitutional arrangements or the distribution of physical power. Successful governments must cultivate and maintain the psychological conditions that support voluntary compliance with political authority, not simply rely on threats of punishment to enforce obedience. The dependence of government on opinion led Hume to distinguish between different types of opinion that play different roles in supporting political authority. Opinion of interest involves the widespread belief that governmental institutions serve the material welfare of the population by maintaining order, protecting property, and promoting economic prosperity. When people believe that existing political arrangements serve their practical interests better than available alternatives, they develop psychological habits of compliance that make governmental authority effective and stable. Opinion of right involves beliefs about the moral legitimacy of particular governmental institutions and the justice of existing distributions of political power. Even governments that effectively promote material welfare may face opposition if they are perceived as fundamentally unjust or illegitimate, according to prevailing moral standards. Successful governments must cultivate both types of opinion by demonstrating their practical effectiveness while also conforming to widely accepted standards of political morality and procedural fairness. Hume's empirical approach to politics led him to important conclusions about constitutional design and the proper structure of governmental institutions. He argued that the best governments are those that achieve their beneficial social functions through institutional mechanisms that work with natural human psychology rather than requiring extraordinary virtue or rationality from political participants. Political institutions should be designed on the assumption that people will generally act according to their perceived interests rather than abstract moral principles. And they should create incentive structures that channel self-interested behaviour towards socially beneficial outcomes. This approach to institutional design emphasized the importance of separation of powers, checks and balances, and other constitutional mechanisms that prevent the concentration of political authority in ways that might encourage abuse. Good government depends more on good institutional design than on the moral character of particular political leaders, though both factors contribute to political success. Constitutional arrangements that rely primarily on the virtue of political leaders are inherently unstable because they cannot guarantee that future leaders will possess the same moral qualities as their predecessors. These insights about institutional design influenced Hume's evaluation of different forms of government and his predictions about the likely development of political institutions over time. He was particularly interested in the English constitutional system, which he saw as an example of how traditional monarchical institutions could evolve gradually toward greater political freedom without violent revolution or systematic constitutional replacement. The English system achieved many of the benefits of democratic government through institutional mechanisms that limited royal authority and protected individual rights, while maintaining social stability and continuity with historical traditions. But Hume also recognized that institutional arrangements that work well in particular historical circumstances may become less effective as social and economic conditions change. Political institutions must maintain enough flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving the essential functions that justify their existence in the first place. This balance between stability and adaptability represents one of the central challenges of constitutional design and long-term political success. Hume's political philosophy also addressed questions about the proper scope of governmental authority and the relationship between individual liberty and social order. He rejected both extremes of political thought that either granted unlimited authority to government or attempted to minimize governmental functions to the point where essential social coordination would become impossible. Government authority is necessary to maintain justice, protect property rights, provide public goods, and resolve conflicts that would otherwise lead to social disruption. But governmental power also creates risks of oppression and abuse that require institutional safeguards and constitutional limitations. The proper scope of government depends on empirical questions about which social functions can be effectively performed through voluntary cooperation and which functions require coordinated political action backed by legal authority. These empirical questions do not have universal answers but must be resolved differently in different societies depending on their particular circumstances, resources and cultural traditions. This pragmatic and empirical approach to political questions made Hume's political philosophy influential among later thinkers who sought alternatives to both revolutionary radicalism and reactionary conservatism. His emphasis on gradual institutional evolution, attention to unintended consequences, and skepticism about utopian political schemes influenced the development of political liberalism and constitutional democracy. His insights about the psychological foundations of political authority and the importance of public opinion influenced the development of modern political science and democratic theory. Contemporary discussions about institutional design, political legitimacy, and the relationship between individual rights and social welfare continue to draw on insights that Hume first articulated in his systematic study of political phenomena. His approach to political philosophy remains relevant for anyone interested in understanding how political institutions actually work, rather than how they ought to work according to abstract moral or rational principles. The science of government that Hume pioneered continues to provide valuable insights for contemporary political analysis and institutional reform. Part 13. Taste, Beauty and the Standard of Aesthetic Judgment. Hume's investigation into aesthetic experience and artistic judgment revealed the same tension between subjective psychology and claims to universal validity that characterized his analysis of moral sentiment and rational belief. He approached questions about beauty, taste and artistic merit with his characteristic empirical methodology, examining how people actually make aesthetic judgments rather than attempting to derive standards of beauty from abstract principles. His analysis of aesthetic experience became one of the most influential theories in the history of philosophical aesthetics, showing how subjective emotional responses can support intersubjective standards of artistic evaluation without requiring objective aesthetic properties in the world itself. This approach to aesthetic philosophy helped establish the modern understanding of the relationship between individual taste and cultural standards of artistic excellence. When Hume examined his own aesthetic responses and invited others to examine theirs, he discovered that aesthetic judgment involves a distinctive kind of emotional experience that differs from both ordinary sensory pleasure and moral approval. The feeling of beauty arises spontaneously when we encounter objects or experiences that please us in particular ways, but this feeling has characteristics that distinguish it from simple personal preference. When you judge that a sunset is beautiful or a poem is excellent, you do not merely report your private psychological response, but claim that others should share your evaluation if they approach the object with appropriate attention and sensitivity. Aesthetic judgment thus involves what Hume called a sentiment of taste that has both subjective and intersubjective dimensions. It is subjective because it involves genuine emotional response rather than abstract intellectual analysis, but it is intersubjective because it claims validity for others who possess similar aesthetic capacities. Understanding this complex structure of aesthetic judgment became central to Hume's aesthetic philosophy. But Hume also recognized that people often disagree about aesthetic questions in ways that seem to challenge the possibility of any meaningful standard of taste. Objects that please one person may displease another, and cultural traditions differ dramatically in their aesthetic preferences and artistic practices. If aesthetic judgment expresses subjective sentiment rather than objective knowledge, then it might seem that all aesthetic opinions are equally valid, and that disputes about artistic merit cannot be rationally resolved. This conclusion would undermine the entire enterprise of art criticism, artistic education, and cultural evaluation of aesthetic achievement. Hume sought to find a middle path between aesthetic relativism that makes all judgments equally valid and aesthetic, absolutism that grounds aesthetic judgment in objective properties independent of human response. His solution involved investigating the conditions under which aesthetic judgment functions most reliably and developing criteria for identifying superior aesthetic sensitivity. Hume argued that meaningful standards of taste emerge naturally from the operation of human psychology under optimal conditions for aesthetic judgment. While all aesthetic judgment involves subjective sentiment, some people possess psychological capacities that make their aesthetic judgments more reliable and valuable than others. These superior aesthetic capacities include delicacy of taste, that allows detection of subtle aesthetic qualities, breadth of experience that provides knowledge of diverse artistic traditions and techniques, freedom from prejudice that prevents irrelevant factors from distorting aesthetic evaluation, good sense that supports sound reasoning about aesthetic relationships, and practice that refines aesthetic sensitivity through repeated exposure to excellent art. People who possess these qualifications in high degrees constitute what Hume called true judges, whose aesthetic opinions provide the most reliable guide to genuine artistic merit. The standard of taste emerges from the convergence of judgment among these qualified critics, rather than from abstract principles or objective aesthetic properties. This approach grounded aesthetic standards in human psychology while acknowledging that some people are better qualified to make aesthetic judgments than others. The psychological analysis of aesthetic judgment led Hume to important insights about the relationship between aesthetic experience and other aspects of human psychology. He noticed that aesthetic pleasure often involves recognition of complex relationships between parts and wholes, means and ends, or expressions and meanings that require sophisticated cognitive processing. The beauty of a musical composition may depend on intricate patterns of repetition and variation that unfold over time, while the excellence of a painting may involve subtle relationships between colour, form and subject matter that reward careful attention. This suggests that aesthetic judgment involves intellectual as well as emotional elements, though the intellectual analysis serves primarily to enhance and refine emotional response rather than replace it. Aesthetic education should therefore focus on developing both emotional sensitivity and intellectual understanding of artistic techniques and traditions. The most sophisticated aesthetic judgment combines immediate emotional response with cultivated understanding of the artistic means through which aesthetic effects are achieved. Hume also explored the social dimensions of aesthetic judgment and the relationship between individual taste and cultural traditions. Individual aesthetic development occurs within particular cultural contexts that provide artistic examples, critical vocabularies, and social support for aesthetic experience. Different cultures may emphasize different aesthetic values and develop different artistic traditions, but this cultural variation does not necessarily undermine the possibility of meaningful aesthetic evaluation. Cultural differences in aesthetic preference may reflect different but equally legitimate approaches to aesthetic experience, or they may reflect differences in aesthetic sophistication and cultural development. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires careful empirical investigation into the conditions that promote aesthetic flourishing, rather than assuming either that all cultural differences are equally valid or that one particular cultural tradition possesses exclusive access to aesthetic truth. This approach to cultural aesthetic differences anticipated later anthropological and sociological investigations into the social construction of artistic meaning and aesthetic value. The implications of Hume's aesthetic theory extended beyond philosophical aesthetics to practical questions about artistic criticism, cultural policy, and aesthetic education. If aesthetic standards emerge from the judgment of qualified critics rather than objective principles, then art criticism should focus on developing and applying superior aesthetic sensitivity rather than imposing rigid theoretical frameworks. Critics should cultivate the psychological qualities that support reliable aesthetic judgment, while remaining open to new artistic developments that may challenge established aesthetic categories. Similarly, aesthetic education should emphasize the development of aesthetic sensitivity through exposure to excellent art, rather than the memorization of abstract aesthetic principles. Cultural institutions like museums, schools, and artistic organizations should create opportunities for aesthetic experience that allow individuals to develop their own aesthetic capacities while learning from the accumulated wisdom of cultural traditions. This approach to aesthetic education emphasized the importance of direct aesthetic experience combined with gradual development of critical sophistication. Hume's aesthetic philosophy also had important implications for understanding the relationship between aesthetic value and other kinds of value in human experience. He argued that aesthetic judgment operates according to different principles than moral judgment, though both involve sentiment rather than reason, and both claim intersubjective validity. Aesthetic merit depends primarily on the capacity to produce appropriate aesthetic pleasure in qualified observers, while moral merit depends primarily on the tendency to promote human welfare and social cooperation. These different criteria mean that aesthetic and moral evaluation may sometimes conflict, as when artistically excellent works portray morally questionable behavior, or when morally admirable actions lack aesthetic appeal. Understanding these relationships between different types of value became important for thinking about the proper role of art in human life and the relationship between artistic and moral education. Hume's analysis suggested that aesthetic experience makes distinctive and irreplaceable contributions to human flourishing that cannot be reduced to moral, political, or practical utility. The influence of Hume's aesthetic philosophy extended far beyond the 18th century and continues to shape contemporary discussions about artistic evaluation, cultural criticism, and aesthetic education. His approach to the standard of taste influenced the development of art criticism and cultural theory, while his analysis of aesthetic judgment influenced psychological and philosophical investigations into the nature of aesthetic experience. Contemporary debates about aesthetic relativism, cultural appropriation, and the canon formation in artistic traditions continue to grapple with questions that Hume first articulated in his systematic investigation of aesthetic phenomena. His emphasis on the psychological foundations of aesthetic judgment and the social construction of aesthetic standards anticipated many later developments in aesthetic theory that emphasized the importance of understanding aesthetic experience as a natural human capacity that develops through cultural participation. Hume's aesthetic philosophy thus remains relevant for anyone interested in understanding how aesthetic judgment actually works, rather than how it ought to work according to abstract aesthetic principles. His approach continues to provide valuable insights for contemporary aesthetic theory and practical aesthetic criticism. Part 14. The Historian and the Science of Human Nature. Hume's work as a historian represented not merely a separate career from his philosophical investigations, but rather the practical application of his empirical method to the study of human behavior on a grand historical scale. His massive history of England, which occupied much of his later career and brought him far more fame during his lifetime than his philosophical writings, exemplified his approach to understanding human nature through careful observation of how people actually behave under different circumstances and social conditions. This historical work was not simply narrative storytelling, but rather a systematic attempt to discover the psychological and social laws that govern human behavior by examining patterns across different historical periods and cultural contexts. Hume's approach to historical investigation helped establish the modern understanding of history as a scientific discipline that could reveal important truths about human nature and social organization. Hume rejected the traditional approach to historical writing that focused primarily on the actions of great leaders, military campaigns and political events, while ignoring the broader social and economic forces that shape human behavior. Instead, he sought to understand the underlying causes of historical change by investigating the beliefs, customs, institutions, and material conditions that influence how ordinary people think and act. His historical method emphasized the importance of understanding the psychology of historical actors rather than simply narrating the sequence of external events. People in different historical periods face different circumstances and operate according to different beliefs and values, but they possess the same basic psychological capacities and respond to similar psychological pressures. Understanding historical change, therefore, requires identifying the psychological and social mechanisms that connect particular circumstances to particular patterns of behavior across different times and places. This approach to historical causation made history relevant to the general science of human nature rather than simply a collection of entertaining or morally instructive stories about the past. The philosophical foundations of Hume's historical method emerged directly from his analysis of causation and induction in natural philosophy. Just as natural science discovers regular patterns in physical phenomena that allow prediction and control of natural events, historical science could discover regular patterns in human behavior that would improve understanding of social and political phenomena. But historical investigation faces special challenges that do not arise in natural science because human behavior involves consciousness, intentionality, and cultural learning that create more complex causal relationships than those found in purely physical systems. Historical actors possess beliefs and values that influence their behavior, but these beliefs and values are themselves influenced by social circumstances and historical traditions that change over time. Understanding historical causation, therefore, requires attention to both the psychological mechanisms that govern individual behavior and the social processes that shape collective beliefs and institutions. This dual focus on individual psychology and social dynamics became characteristic of Hume's approach to historical explanation. Hume's historical investigations revealed important patterns in the development of political institutions that confirmed his philosophical analysis of government and political obligation. He traced the gradual evolution of English constitutional government from its medieval origins through the political conflicts of the 17th century. Showing how institutional changes emerged from the interaction between changing social conditions and persistent human psychological tendencies. The development of parliamentary authority, legal protections for individual rights, and constitutional limitations on royal power represented responses to practical political problems rather than the implementation of abstract political theories. Political actors in different periods faced different challenges and possessed different resources, but they were motivated by similar desires for security, prosperity, and social recognition that created predictable patterns in political behavior. Understanding these patterns helped explain why some political innovations succeeded while others failed, and why some societies developed more effective political institutions than others. This historical analysis provided empirical support for Hume's philosophical arguments about the conventional foundations of political authority and the importance of institutional design for political success. The historical study of religious and intellectual development also confirmed Hume's philosophical analysis of the relationship between reason, belief, and social influence. He investigated how religious beliefs and philosophical doctrines spread through populations and change over time, revealing the psychological and social mechanisms that govern the formation and transformation of cultural beliefs. Religious and philosophical movements succeed not primarily because of their logical superiority, but because they satisfy psychological needs, conform to existing cultural patterns, or serve the interests of influential social groups. Even apparently rational intellectual developments like the scientific revolution involved complex social processes that cannot be understood through purely logical analysis of competing theories. The historical study of belief formation thus revealed the limitations of purely rational approaches to understanding human opinion, while highlighting the importance of psychological and social factors that philosophers often ignored. This historical perspective on intellectual development reinforced Hume's skeptical conclusions about the authority of reason, while providing insight into the natural processes through which human knowledge actually develops and changes. Hume's historical method also emphasized the importance of understanding economic and social conditions as fundamental causes of political and cultural change. He investigated how changes in trade, technology, population, and social organization created new opportunities and challenges that required institutional adaptation and cultural innovation. The growth of commerce and manufacturing in early modern Europe, for example, created new social classes with different interests and values than traditional agricultural societies, leading to political conflicts and constitutional changes that could not be understood without attention to these underlying economic transformations. Similarly, changes in military technology and organization affected the balance of power between different social groups and created pressures for political innovation that shaped the development of modern governmental institutions. This materialist approach to historical explanation anticipated later developments in social science that emphasized the importance of economic and technological factors in social change. But Hume avoided crude economic determinism by maintaining attention to the psychological and cultural mechanisms through which material conditions influence human behavior and social organization. The practical implications of Hume's approach to historical investigation extended far beyond academic historical scholarship to questions about contemporary political and social policy. Understanding the historical development of current institutions and practices provides insight into their likely future evolution and the conditions under which they are most likely to function effectively. Historical analysis can reveal unintended consequences of past policies and institutional changes that provide valuable guidance for contemporary decision-making. It can also identify the social and psychological conditions that have promoted or hindered human flourishing in different historical contexts, suggesting practical approaches to contemporary problems. But Hume emphasized that historical knowledge cannot provide simple recipes for contemporary action because historical circumstances are never exactly repeated and because human behavior involves enough complexity and contingency to make precise prediction impossible. The proper use of historical knowledge involves understanding general patterns and tendencies rather than expecting exact repetition of past events or mechanical application of historical lessons to contemporary problems. Hume's integration of philosophical and historical investigation created a model for empirical human science that influenced many later developments in psychology, sociology, economics, and political science. His approach demonstrated how careful empirical investigation could reveal important truths about human nature and social organization without requiring the controlled experimental methods that work well in physical science, but are often impossible in social investigation. Historical analysis provides a kind of natural experiment in which different societies and time periods offer examples of how human behavior responds to different conditions and institutional arrangements. By comparing these natural experiments systematically, social scientists can identify general principles that govern human behavior while remaining sensitive to the complexity and variability that characterize social phenomena. This comparative historical approach became fundamental to later social science methodology and continues to provide valuable insights into contemporary social and political problems. Hume's work as a historian thus represented not a departure from his philosophical interests, but rather their practical extension into the systematic study of human behavior in its full historical and social complexity. Part 15. The Enduring Legacy of Human Understanding. Nearly 3 centuries after David Hume completed his revolutionary investigation into human nature, his intellectual influence continues to shape how educated people think about knowledge, reality, morality, and social organization across multiple academic disciplines and practical domains. His systematic application of empirical methods to fundamental philosophical questions created new approaches to understanding human experience that transcended traditional boundaries between philosophy, psychology, and social science. The problems he identified and the methods he developed for addressing them remain central to contemporary intellectual life, making him one of the most practically influential philosophers in human history. Understanding Hume's legacy requires tracing how his insights have been developed, modified and applied by later thinkers who continue to grapple with the fundamental questions he first articulated with systematic rigor. Hume's analysis of the limits of human reason had profound and lasting impact on how philosophers approach questions about knowledge and reality. His demonstration that inductive reasoning cannot be rationally justified without circular argument continues to challenge scientists and philosophers who seek secure foundations for empirical knowledge. Modern philosophy of science has largely accepted Hume's conclusion that scientific theories cannot be proven true through empirical evidence, leading to sophisticated accounts of scientific reasoning that emphasize hypothesis testing, falsification, and theoretical comparison rather than inductive proof. Contemporary epistemology has also absorbed Hume's insights about the role of natural belief and psychological mechanisms in knowledge formation, leading to naturalized approaches to epistemology that study how human cognitive capacities actually function rather than how they ought to function according to abstract logical principles. The problem of induction remains unsolved in any final sense, but Hume's analysis continues to set the terms for contemporary discussions about the relationship between empirical evidence and theoretical knowledge. His influence extends to practical questions about scientific education, public policy formation, and critical thinking instruction that must address the tension between skeptical philosophical conclusions and the practical necessity of making decisions based on uncertain evidence. The impact of Hume's moral philosophy on contemporary ethical theory has been equally profound and multifaceted. His demonstration that moral judgments cannot be derived from purely factual premises established the framework for modern discussions about the relationship between science and ethics that continue to influence contemporary bioethics, environmental ethics, and social policy analysis. His emphasis on moral sentiment, rather than rational principle, anticipated the development of moral psychology as a distinct field of empirical investigation that studies how people actually make moral judgments, rather than how they ought to make them according to abstract ethical theories. Contemporary research in moral psychology, evolutionary ethics, and experimental philosophy has confirmed many of Hume's insights about the emotional foundations of moral judgment, while extending his analysis through sophisticated empirical methods that were unavailable in the 18th century. His approach to moral philosophy as empirical investigation into human psychology has also influenced practical approaches to moral education, conflict resolution, and social policy that emphasize understanding and working with natural human psychology rather than imposing abstract moral principles through authoritarian methods. The tension between moral objectivity and moral sentiment that Hume first articulated systematically continues to generate productive research and debate across multiple disciplines. Hume's political philosophy has had lasting influence on constitutional theory, democratic practice, and public policy analysis through its emphasis on institutional design and empirical investigation of political behaviour. His insights about the dependence of government on opinion rather than force influenced the development of modern democratic theory and public opinion research. His emphasis on designing political institutions that work with natural human psychology rather than requiring extraordinary virtue influenced the American constitutional framers and continues to inform contemporary discussions about institutional reform and democratic governance. His approach to political legitimacy through utility and convention rather than natural rights or social contract continues to influence utilitarian approaches to political evaluation and policy analysis. Contemporary political science has absorbed Hume's insights about the importance of understanding political psychology and the unintended consequences of institutional arrangements, leading to sophisticated empirical research programs that investigate how political institutions actually function rather than how they ought to function according to abstract political principles. His influence extends to practical questions about constitutional design, electoral systems, and public administration that must balance theoretical ideals with realistic understanding of human psychological and social limitations. The methodological innovations that Hume introduced into philosophy and social inquiry have had perhaps even more lasting influence than his specific conclusions about particular philosophical problems. His systematic application of empirical methods to philosophical questions helped establish the modern understanding of philosophy as continuous with natural and social science, rather than a separate domain of pure rational inquiry. His emphasis on psychological investigation and social observation influenced the development of experimental psychology, sociological research and anthropological fieldwork that provide empirical foundations for understanding human behavior and social organization. His approach to concepts as empirical phenomena that can be studied through careful analysis of their origins and functions influenced the development of conceptual analysis, linguistic philosophy, and cognitive science. His integration of philosophical argument with historical investigation provided a model for interdisciplinary research that crosses traditional academic boundaries to address complex theoretical and practical problems. Contemporary intellectual life continues to benefit from the methodological sophistication and empirical orientation that Hume brought to fundamental questions about human nature and social organization. Hume's influence on contemporary culture extends far beyond academic philosophy and social science to practical questions about education, public discourse, and individual self-understanding. His analysis of the relationship between reason and emotion has influenced therapeutic approaches in psychology and psychiatry that emphasize understanding and working with natural human psychology rather than attempting to eliminate or suppress emotional responses. His insights about the social construction of personal identity have influenced contemporary discussions about individual development, cultural identity, and social belonging. His emphasis on intellectual humility and recognition of the limits of human reason has influenced approaches to public discourse and political debate that emphasize evidence-based reasoning while acknowledging uncertainty and complexity. His naturalistic approach to moral and aesthetic judgment has influenced contemporary approaches to cultural criticism, artistic evaluation, and moral education that emphasize developing natural human capacities rather than imposing external standards through authoritarian methods. The intellectual virtues that Hume exemplified, including curiosity, honesty, tolerance, and commitment to evidence, continue to provide valuable models for contemporary intellectual and public life. Perhaps most importantly, Hume's approach to fundamental questions about human existence provides a model for thinking about complex problems that combines intellectual rigor with practical wisdom and emotional sophistication. He demonstrated that rigorous philosophical analysis need not lead to cynicism or despair, but can enhance appreciation for the richness and complexity of human experience. His combination of skeptical reasoning with natural belief showed how intellectual honesty about the limits of human knowledge can coexist with practical confidence and emotional engagement with life. His empirical approach to moral and political questions provided alternatives to both dogmatic authoritarianism and relativistic nihilism that continue to be relevant for contemporary social and political challenges. His integration of individual psychological investigation with social and historical analysis offered approaches to understanding human behavior that avoid both individualistic reductionism and collectivistic determinism. Most fundamentally, his commitment to understanding human nature as it actually is rather than as philosophers think it ought to be provides a foundation for realistic approaches to individual development and social improvement that work with, rather than against, basic features of human psychology and social organization. David Hume died in 1776. But the questions he raised and the methods he developed for addressing them remain as relevant today as they were nearly 3 centuries ago. His intellectual legacy demonstrates that philosophical investigation at its best combines theoretical sophistication with practical relevance, logical rigor with psychological insight, and individual analysis with social understanding. In an age still struggling with dogmatism and false certainty, political polarization and social fragmentation, scientific complexity and moral uncertainty, Hume's approach to fundamental questions about human nature and social organization continues to provide valuable resources for contemporary thought and practice. His greatest contribution may be his demonstration that intellectual honesty, empirical investigation, and practical wisdom can work together to enhance rather than diminish human understanding and human flourishing. The science of human nature that he pioneered remains unfinished, but his example continues to inspire and guide anyone who seeks to understand the complex realities of human existence with both intellectual courage and practical compassion. David Hume's enduring legacy lies not in providing final answers to fundamental questions, but in showing how such questions can be approached with the combination of skeptical reasoning and natural humanity that characterizes human beings at their intellectual and moral best.